I remember the heat most of all, how it clung to the skin like wet canvas. It was early March, the height of the dry season, and the bush in northeastern South Africa cracked and sighed under the weight of the sun. The air was thick with dust kicked up by our patrol vehicle as we moved slowly through the winding dirt roads of the reserve. We were 3 on the patrol that day, myself, Thomas, one of the senior anti-poaching unit leaders, and Lorato, a local ranger with more tracking experience than all of us combined. I had been volunteering with the reserve for about 4 months at that point, part of a broader wildlife rehabilitation program. I had come in thinking I'd be helping to tag rhinos, maybe feed orphaned cheetah cubs. But within a few weeks, the brutal truth of the illegal wildlife trade came crashing in. The poaching wasn't selective. It wasn't just rhinos and elephants. Every living thing with a value was at risk, and the most hunted mammal in the world? It wasn't what I expected. It was the pangolin. Until that year, I had never even seen one in real life. That morning, just after sunrise, we got a tip-off from a neighboring village. A man had been seen coming through a known poaching corridor with a suspicious-looking pack. There had been whispers of pangolin sightings along the southern boundary of the reserve, an area we had only just reinforced with additional fencing and camera traps. Most local villagers stayed clear of it, but the few who worked with us had started passing on what they heard. It was still early when we reached the point indicated by our informant. We parked the Land Cruiser a few hundred meters from the trailhead and continued on foot. Lorato picked up the track within minutes, a fresh print, barely an hour old. The soil was dry, but not so dry that it couldn't hold the imprint of a heavy boot. We moved quickly, keeping low. The tension that always preceded a possible arrest pressed into my chest like a stone. About an hour later, we saw him. He was sitting beneath a thorn tree, facing away from us, his canvas bag at his side. He hadn't seen us yet, so Thomas signaled silently and flanked right, while Lorato and I came in from the left. When Thomas made the move, the man startled, tried to run, but Lorato was fast. She had him down before he could make it 3 paces. The whole thing was over in seconds. What happened next is the part I'll never forget. We opened the bag. At first, I thought it was just a mass of scales and blood, some sort of cruel display or trophy. But then it moved. Slowly, weakly, curled into a tight ball, barely breathing, was a Temminck's ground pangolin, alive, but only just. I didn't know how to react. I had seen photos, read about pangolins in the reserve's training materials, but I had never seen one up close. They were nocturnal, shy, and extremely hard to track in the wild. This one must have been taken during the night, possibly while it was foraging near the edge of the fence line. It had been stuffed into that canvas bag, likely for hours, with no air, no food, and no water. Its scales were scratched, some cracked. The edges were dull and flaked with blood. It didn't uncurl, not even when we lifted it carefully and placed it into a ventilated crate in the back of the vehicle. It didn't fight. It barely moved. We radioed ahead to the reserve's emergency veterinary clinic. The poacher was handed over to the authorities. It was all protocol, but what happened next wasn't routine at all. Dr. Sunil, our wildlife vet, met us at the clinic. She had worked with pangolins before, mostly in coordination with national rescue operations. But even she looked shaken when she saw the state of the animal. Male, she said, after the initial examination. Young adult. Severely dehydrated. Bruised. Likely a few cracked scales. No broken limbs. No visible fractures. She paused. But he's in shock. It's hard to say if he'll make it through the night. We stayed with him for hours. I sat by the crate and watched him breathe, shallow and ragged. We didn't even have a name for him yet. That would come later. Right now, it was about survival. That first night was the longest. Pangolins are incredibly sensitive creatures. Their stress response can be fatal, especially when combined with physical trauma. We couldn't force feed him. Couldn't handle him too much. Couldn't move him again. All we could do was keep the room quiet, dark, and cool, and pray that he would fight. And he did. By dawn, his breathing had stabilized. He was still curled tight, but when Dr. Sunil approached with a shallow dish of water and gently nudged it under the edge of his scales, he shifted ever so slightly, just enough to let his snout touch the water. He drank. Not much. But it was something. The next few days were critical. We monitored him around the clock. Slowly, with extreme care, we introduced a pangolin-specific diet, a specialized ant and termite mixture. Most people don't know this, but pangolins can't just be fed anything. Their diet is so specific that feeding them incorrectly can kill them. We brought in soil samples from known termite mounds, carefully introduced the natural textures and scents of his environment, and eventually, he started to respond. He uncurling for the first time was like watching a miracle unfold. He moved slowly, each step unsure. His tail dragged slightly, but he was moving, living. That's when we gave him his name, Didlong, which means hidden in Setswana. It felt appropriate, hidden from the world for so long. Hidden from the poachers, hidden in that bag, now, finally, revealed. His recovery wasn't fast. Pangolins don't heal on a schedule. It took weeks before he regained full strength. And all that time, we prepared for what we hoped would come next, rehabilitation and release. The challenge with pangolins is that you can't just open a cage and set them free. They imprint easily on their temporary environments. They can't be released into areas where poaching is still active, and they must be closely monitored post-release to ensure they adapt. We worked with the reserve managers to secure a safe zone, a sanctuary within the reserve boundaries, far from human access, with 24/7 monitoring and anti-poaching patrols. It was fenced, but it covered hundreds of hectares, with enough natural termite mounds and bush cover to sustain a healthy pangolin population. By the end of his 3rd month with us, Didlong had gained weight, started digging, and resumed foraging at night with minimal human supervision. He would walk beside us during his nighttime outings, following the scent trails we laid to mimic termite movement. He was cautious, but curious, never straying far from the trees, always alert. His instincts were returning. The night of his release was one I will never forget. We transported him at dusk, just as the sun dipped below the Thornville horizon. The sanctuary team met us at the gate. No cameras, no crowds, just silence. We carried him to the center, near a known termite mound, and set the crate down gently. Didlong didn't hesitate. He stepped out slowly, sniffed the air, and ambled toward the underbrush. Within minutes, he was gone, swallowed by the bush, as if he had never been there. But we knew better. He had been there, and he had survived. He had been taken from the wild, smuggled in a bag, nearly died, but he had survived. And that was only the beginning of his story. The night Didlong disappeared into the bush, we didn't leave right away. We stood still for a long time, just listening. There was something sacred about that moment. A creature that had every reason to give up had chosen to live, and now we were letting him go. But the truth is, we didn't truly let him go. Pangolin rehabilitation is nothing like the release of other animals. They require post-release monitoring, often for months, sometimes longer. So while we opened the gate and let him step back into his ancestral landscape, we also fitted him with a lightweight VHF transmitter attached to a scale near the base of his tail. It didn't hurt him, it was professionally designed to stay out of his way, and it would eventually fall off on its own, but it gave us a way to track his movements. I joined the post-release monitoring team on a rotational basis. Each of us was assigned to night shifts, following Didlong from a respectful distance with handheld telemetry gear. The goal was simple: make sure he was feeding properly, moving naturally, and avoiding danger. The sanctuary itself was ideal. It stretched over 600 hectares of protected savanna, mostly flat with patches of mopane woodland and acacia scrub. Termite mounds rose like stone temples across the landscape, some taller than a man. It was a haven, not just for Didlong, but for small populations of other endangered species we were slowly reintroducing. The area had been poacher-free for years, thanks to constant patrols, camera traps, and community involvement. Still, we took nothing for granted. That first week, we hardly saw him. He moved deep into the interior, traveling almost 3 kilometers each night. For an animal that had nearly died only months before, it was extraordinary. He dug shallow burrows, foraged at dusk, and returned to rest in hidden hollows beneath old termite mounds. Then came a moment I'll never forget. It was about 2 a.m. on the 5th night. I was crouched behind a fallen tree with my telemetry unit buzzing faintly in my hand. I had finally locked in his location and was moving quietly toward the signal. I reached a small clearing dotted with low brush and termite nests, and then I saw him. He was standing upright. Pangolins sometimes do this to sniff the air, with his front claws held against his chest, tail balanced on the ground. The moonlight made his scales gleam a pale bronze. He stood like that for maybe 20 seconds, completely still, before dropping down and beginning to dig at the base of a mound. I watched him feed. He tore open the mound with precise, practiced movements. His tongue, nearly 40 centimeters long, flicked in and out rapidly as he harvested termites. His tail swayed slightly, helping him balance. It was like watching a living fossil, one of the oldest lineages of mammals on the planet, doing exactly what it was born to do. He was home. Over the next several weeks, Didlong continued to thrive. We tracked his movements, mapped his burrows, documented his foraging success, and recorded his weight and behavior during occasional, minimal contact checkups. He adapted quickly to the natural diet, never showed signs of malnutrition, and developed predictable movement patterns. But it wasn't without its challenges. In mid-June, about 6 weeks after his release, we noticed his signal had stopped moving. For 24 hours, it stayed in the same spot near the northern boundary of the sanctuary. My heart sank. We feared the worst: injury, illness, or even a predator. Pangolins are covered in scales, yes, but they are not immune to large carnivores or even honey badgers, which are clever and persistent. We organized a small team and moved out before dawn. I led the search, telemetry unit in hand, tracking the now stationary signal. It led us to a rocky outcrop near a large, ancient termite mound. There, in the shadow of the rocks, we found him, curled up tightly in his burrow, his scales dusty but intact. He was sleeping. It turned out that Didlong had discovered a rich feeding ground and had stayed close, digging multiple tunnels into the same mound. The transmitter signal had looked stationary, but in reality, he had just been operating within a small radius. We laughed in relief. It was a good reminder not to panic, and more importantly, to trust the animal. He knew what he was doing. But that near miss taught us to be vigilant. The next month, we upgraded the monitoring with motion-triggered infrared cameras installed at key points around his preferred feeding areas. These allowed us to observe him without intrusion, capturing hours of footage that confirmed what we hoped. Didlong had fully acclimated to his new life. We began seeing less of him during our patrols, not because he was failing, but because he no longer needed us. He had established his territory, adjusted his internal rhythms to the wild again, and began showing signs of natural independence. He traveled longer distances, dug deeper burrows, and even began scent marking the area, a behavior indicative of territorial establishment in solitary male pangolins. As summer approached again, the termite population swelled. Didlong's body weight increased steadily, and his scales, damaged and dull from the poacher's bag, began to harden, darken, and return to their natural luster. It was around this time that something remarkable happened. We began recording signs of another pangolin in the sanctuary. At first, we weren't sure. Tracks were hard to differentiate, but one of the camera traps caught a blurred image of a smaller pangolin trailing through the same termite mound Didlong had used earlier that week. We didn't interfere. We didn't know the sex or history of the second animal, only that it had not been placed there by us. That meant it had entered naturally, possibly from a neighboring reserve or through one of the animal corridors left open for genetic flow. The next night, Didlong's movement slowed. He circled the same area repeatedly. On camera, we saw him pause at the base of a mound, sniff the air, then retreat, only to return a few hours later. It was subtle, but it hinted at something deeper: instinct, curiosity, and perhaps even connection. Pangolins are solitary, yes, but during breeding periods, they do interact. Whether this was such a case, we'll never know for certain. But for a few nights, Didlong lingered. Then, just as quickly, he resumed his normal routine. We never again saw the second pangolin on camera. Perhaps it moved on. Perhaps it remains, still hidden in the sanctuary's silent folds. But for us, the moment was profound. It meant that the land itself was working. The sanctuary wasn't just a refuge, it was becoming a habitat. By the end of that year, Didlong had become something of a legend in the reserve. His story traveled far, picked up by local conservation groups, later by international wildlife organizations. But we were cautious about exposure. No location data was ever shared publicly. His existence was protected not just by fences and guards, but by secrecy. We stopped checking his transmitter every night by the 1-year mark. It had served its purpose. Eventually, it would fall off, biodegrade. Didlong would be truly wild again, no longer tagged, no longer watched. And that, we all agreed, was the goal. As I write this now, more than a year and a half later, I still think about that day, the moment we opened the poacher's bag and saw a creature folded in fear and near death. I think of the quiet nights following his steps, the first time I saw him uncurl, the way he fed beneath moonlight as if he had never left the wild. Didlong's survival is not just a testament to one animal's resilience. It is a symbol of what can happen when communities, conservationists, and governments come together. His story has helped shift local attitudes. The men and women who once turned a blind eye to pangolin trafficking now volunteer in our outreach programs. Children in nearby schools draw pictures of him. They know his name. They understand what he represents. And that is more than we ever could have hoped for. I used to think saving a pangolin was about the act itself, the rescue, the healing, the release. But I learned through Didlong that saving one pangolin can become something much larger, something that ripples far beyond what we initially see. Didlong disappeared into the bush more than 18 months ago, and since then, we haven't seen him with our own eyes. His transmitter dropped off sometime last summer, as we knew it eventually would. And though we no longer track him, we see the signs. Fresh digging at old termite mounds. Scratch marks along fallen logs. Tracks, distinct, clawed ovals, left in the soft sand after summer rains. These signs remind us, he's still here. Still alive, still thriving, and that would have been enough. But his story didn't end in the bush. After his successful release, we began documenting his case in full, photos, telemetry logs, veterinary reports, and field notes. We compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier that we shared with sandparks, several NGOs working on pangolin trafficking, and eventually, with international organizations focused on endangered species conservation. What we didn't expect was the overwhelming response. One organization, African Pangolin Working Group, reached out almost immediately. They had heard of Didlong through a quiet network of veterinarians and reserve managers. His case, they said, was one of the most detailed rehabilitation and release programs for a Temminck's ground pangolin they had seen at that time. They asked if we'd consider sharing it for training use. We agreed, on the condition that all specific geographic data be redacted. We weren't willing to compromise his safety. Soon, Didlong's journey was being presented at ranger workshops, veterinary training seminars, and conservation conferences. It wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. The power of it was in the methodical, relentless care taken, from the moment we found him in that poacher's bag to the final moment we saw him vanish into the grass. But the most significant impact, in my eyes, happened closer to home. Around the time we released Didlong, something shifted in the nearby communities. The outreach team had been working steadily, running education programs in schools, offering talks in village centers, and holding Q&A sessions with elders. We didn't focus on fear. We didn't show images of mutilated animals. We talked about worth, ecological worth, cultural worth. We introduced pangolins as part of the natural heritage of the land. The story of Didlong became central to that message. When people heard that we had found a pangolin alive in a poacher's sack, and that it had survived, been released, and was now living freely under protection, they listened. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't distant. It had happened right there, just kilometers from their homes. Suddenly, pangolins weren't strange, mythical creatures hidden in textbooks. They were real, vulnerable, and they could be saved. One day, about 9 months after the release, I was walking through the education compound when I saw a boy, maybe 11 or 12, pointing at a large pangolin poster on the wall. He was explaining the scales, the long tongue, and the diet to a younger girl. He was using terms we'd taught in one of the early classroom sessions: insectivore, keratin, ecological niche. I paused to listen. Then he said, this is Didlong. He lives near us now. He eats termites and doesn't hurt anyone. He was almost killed, but we helped him. We protect him now. That moment stayed with me. Because when conservation becomes personal, it becomes powerful. Our poaching intel improved, too. Before, we would hear about trafficking only after the fact, after someone had already been paid, after the animal had vanished. But that changed. Village informants started speaking up earlier. One group of herders even reported a set of strange tire tracks near a remote bush road, which led to the seizure of 2 cages hidden beneath a false floorboard in a vehicle. Inside were 2 live pangolins, dazed, but alive. They were taken to another rehab center. One of them didn't make it. The other did. She was released 9 months later into another secure reserve. Her name is Palessa, which means flower. She wouldn't have survived without that early intel. Without Dithlong's story reaching the people who mattered. The anti-poaching teams adapted, too. We created a protocol specifically for pangolin rescues, drawing on the procedures we refined during Dithlong's case. Everything from transport guidelines to temperature control, emergency feeding techniques, and stress monitoring. We trained 2 new veterinary assistants. Set up a designated low-light, low-noise room for pangolin intake. Invested in 2 telemetry kits funded by a small grant awarded based on our documentation. All of this, because of one animal. But the question I still get asked most is, will you ever see him again? And I always say the same thing, maybe. Maybe not. That's not the point. The point is that he got the life he was supposed to have. Not one defined by captivity, or trauma, or death in a market far from the land where he was born. He got freedom, and that freedom continues to echo in the people who learned from his survival. In our reserve, the word pangolin doesn't raise eyebrows anymore. It raises hands. People want to learn. They want to see the camera trap footage. They want to help. That is the greatest victory of all. I still volunteer here. I don't patrol as often now, but I help train new recruits. When they arrive, I take them through the stories, the good and the bad. I show them the rehab center, the camera traps, the telemetry gear. And before their first night shift, I always tell them about the night Dithlong stood under the moonlight and fed without fear. Because that image is why we do this. We've started a small local scholarship named after him. Each year, 1 student from the surrounding communities is selected to receive full funding for environmental or conservation studies. The first recipient graduated last year. She's now working in the Education Outreach Department, giving talks in the same schools she once sat in as a student. When she introduces herself, she always says, "I'm here because of a pangolin named Dithlong." And I smile every time. Because he's still here, not just in the reserve, but in all of us. In every patrol that walks the perimeter. In every child who learns what scales are made of. In every poacher who chooses not to pick up a trap because they've heard the name and know what it stands for. Dithlong means hidden, yes. But now he's more than that. He's seen, not in cages or photographs, but in the choices we make. The ones that say, this life matters. This fight is worth it. This story isn't over. And maybe, somewhere tonight, deep in the tall grass of the sanctuary, he's digging again, free, alive, and unafraid. That's all we ever wanted. That's everything.